Pistis with Us podcast. Welcome to the Pistis with Us podcast, where our faith unites us in conversation. You can expect thought-provoking discussions with theologians, pastors, scholars, and all other Christians who share the testimony of God's amazing grace. We invite you to be a part of our community to share your thoughts, questions, and stories. Join the conversation. Welcome to another episode of the Pistis with Us podcast. I am your host, Raleigh Clay, and I am joined today by Dr. Teresa Morgan, who is an author. She's a professor, McDonald Agape Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Yale Divinity School. She's also an ordained Anglican priest and soon to be an ordained Episcopal priest. And so, Dr. Morgan, I really appreciate you joining the podcast and being willing to have this conversation with me.
Hello, Raleigh. How nice to be with you. What a great title for a podcast, can I just say?
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, and it goes into one of your incredible works, Roman Faith and Christian Faith, and speaking about Pistis and fides and what's going on with the idea and how it maybe changes over time and morphs over time, which is just an incredible concept of how language changes, how meanings of words can change in general, and how we're understanding what the early church was saying when they say faith that might be different than what we say or mean when we say faith, because the book is quite long and technical in some ways. It's great, but it's long and technical for some. So can you just give like a synopsis of some key themes of the book and what inspired you to explore the topic?
Yes, absolutely. It's a big book. Let's do the headline. Well, how I got into it was that a few years before, I had written a book about Roman popular morality. The moral, ethical thinking of ordinary Greeks and Romans under the Roman Empire. And that was a big survey of all the things that people thought were good or bad, or sometimes good, sometimes bad, biggest survey of ethical. And I thought after that, what would be really interesting would be to do a deep dive into one or two ethical ideas and practices that were really important to people. And I was playing around with various ideas. Shall I do friendship? Shall I do justice? Whatever. And then I realized that trust and the language that is centered around trust, and that is pistis in Greek and fides in Latin. And I'm going to come back to the range of meaning, but those are terms that center around trust. And I suddenly realized that those are really interesting because trust and related ideas are really important in every society, for a start. So, and including in the early Roman Empire, sometimes very difficult in the early Roman Empire. It's an interesting time to talk about trust. But of course, those terms, pistis and fides, are also the words which, in a Christian context, we translate faith or belief. And I thought, well, this is interesting because that's not what those words mean in mainstream Greek and Latin, really.
Right.
So how did Roman trust become Christian faith or Christian belief? And when did that happen? And what was the process? So I wrote a book which was about the concept and the practice of pistis and fides in the early Roman Empire in general, and a little bit in early Judaism, because of course that is incredibly important as background context of Christianity, and then in the emerging Christianity. So, and I'll say a word about the meanings of the words because it's relevant to how Christians come to treat the words. So pistis and its relatives, take the Greek for the sake of argument. The pistis and fides work in very similar ways, but say pistis because that is that's Greek, that's the language that the earliest Christian writings are written in, so that's really relevant to us. Pistis is fundamentally trust, trustworthiness, faithfulness, good faith, entrustedness. And what is important about all those things, they're all related, they're all very relational. They're all very relational terms. But then it means a whole host of extended things too. It can mean credit in a commercial context. It can mean a legal trust in the law. In rhetoric, it can mean a proof. It can also mean sort of things like confidence and even hope. Loyalty, you've talked to Dr. Matthew Bates about that before, the loyalty aspect of pistis, that's definitely a meaning too. It can mean a token of something which the messengers of the Roman emperor would ride or sail around the Roman Empire with messages to the provinces, and they would take a pistis, a token, to prove that they were on royal business, as it were. So it could be a token of trust. So it can have all these very wide meanings, and it can sometimes mean belief, especially in the context of sort of philosophical argument, something you can believe in. But it's not very common in the meaning belief in mainstream Greek. But one of the interesting thing, of course, is that belief becomes a very important meaning to early Christians at some point yet to be discovered.
Right.
So that was my starting point, my point of investigation. I wanted to understand how this language works, how the concepts and the practices that are captured in this language work in the early Roman Empire and then work in early Christianity, and how they turn.
Yeah, and that's just fascinating because I think for the majority of people, if you haven't been exposed to either Greek or Latin or something, like we wouldn't even think they thought of anything different. And so can you speak just a little bit about how important it is to understand what maybe the New Testament authors are getting at when they're talking about pistis, and when they speak of pistis, to how often we think of or the overarching idea of what we think of when we say just faith. I speak about this in my congregation a lot, and so and it's the namesake of the podcast and all of that, and it because it's just so fascinating to me how, in some ways, different that is in just our conceptualization of it.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why also I think that historical type study of the Bible is really valuable. Because sometimes if we look at the language and the meaning of New Testament texts, say, in their original context, we find something that the tradition has forgotten a bit. That has got so added to and has grown so much through time that some bits of the original meaning of the text have got submerged or have got changed. And this is a very good example of this. So I think nowadays, by faith, when we talk about faith, we certainly mean beliefs. We mean lots of practices. We mean worship. We mean prayer. We mean sharing the Eucharist. We mean, all kinds of worship practice. We mean going to church. People nowadays do their faith by going to church, and that was not true until the 4th century. This is really not true for very early Christians. Fascinating. We talk about the leap of faith. We talk a lot about faith as a step into the absolute unknown. And that's partly because the sense of the mystery of God in some ways has grown through Christian history. And again, that idea of the leap of faith, of taking a leap that, because you don't know, well, despite the fact you don't know what you're getting into, sometimes even because you don't know what you're getting into, that is not a very early Christian thing. They thought they had reasons, they thought they knew why they were doing it. So that they had I think a less powerful sense of mystery than in some ways has developed later in Christianity. So we talk nowadays too about looking at things with the eyes of faith. Again, a kind of mystical form of seeing, which is different from ordinary seeing. And again, that's grown through time. So you go right back to the very earliest writings and you try to understand them in their own time and in their own right, as it were, and not worry too much about all the meanings that we give to faith. Right. And two things really come out, I think. One is that for sure, early Christians believed things. They believed things about God. They believed things about Jesus Christ, about the death of Christ, about the resurrection. For sure, they believed things. And those things were fundamental. But it wasn't what you believed that made you a Christian, that got you into the community and brought you to the hope of salvation and life in the community. That was something else. And the word they used for that is pistis and pistuane language. In what I think must be the relational meaning. So you believe things, and on the basis of your belief, you put your trust in God and Christ. And that step, the step of trust, is the life-changing step. And I think I think that is more intuitive if you sort of illustrate it with examples from the time. So, for instance, if you were a regular Roman polytheist in the 1st century, you would believe lots of things about lots and lots of different gods. But you wouldn't worship them all. because some of them would be the gods of another city or somebody else's farm or another tribe, or they would just be a god like a healing god you didn't need at this moment. So there's a big difference between belief and worship, which is very clear in polytheism because there are lots of gods. But even say, if you were Jewish in the 1st century, you could believe that Abraham had been taken up to be with God without worshipping Abraham. You could believe in angels without worshipping angels. You worship the one God, And that, I think, illustrates the difference between belief and life-changing commitment that expresses itself in worship. And early Christians have got exactly that same 2-step process. They believe a lot of things about God and Christ and the Spirit of God, and how that God's action through Christ changes the possibilities for humanity. Then they act on it by putting their trust in God. So trust is really central in that early thinking, in a way which, oddly, because we have acquired so many other meanings to faith, the trust one, well, it's fallen out of kind of what the things the church says officially. It's fallen out of theology. Theology of trust. The interesting thing is it has never fallen out of popular thinking. If you go on the internet now, you will find any number of books called things like Trust in God and God is faithful, and you can always trust God. So trust is actually a thing which people instinctively understand is important, but it's fallen out of the kind of formal aspects of the tradition a little bit, and that's what I would like to recover through this book, really.
Right, and I think if we allow the book to flesh that out and to speak to us, that there is a recovery of that idea, because and if what I'm hearing is correct, and correct me if I'm wrong in repeating this, that there's certainly an element of pistis that is an assent to facts or to knowledge or something like that.
Absolutely, definitely.
But the way that most often it's used early on doesn't stop there. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right. People go on to use it of that life-changing commitment that you make on the basis of what you believe.
Okay. And so it can still be used in a sense like James uses it, that the demons believe, and they shudder, but that doesn't have the same element of trust or fidelity or even a relational aspect of what would come from belief. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right. The demons are a brilliant example because they do. James exactly says, they believe all sorts of things about God. That doesn't mean they put their trust in God.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they are faithful to God at all, because they're demons, the opposite.
Right. Yeah. And so within this concept, and you've mentioned it a couple of times just as you've been talking about this idea of trust and faithfulness, that obedience seems to come right alongside, if not just integrated into the concept of pistis or faith, as we would say.
Yes. So sort of trust language has got a lot of other ideas and practices which are closely related and very often go alongside it. And one of those is kind of confidence and hope. Right. Everywhere in Greek and in Latin, very often, those things go together. And another one is obedience. So where you trust, particularly where you trust, a divinity or a human being who has a higher status than you also obey them. It goes with trusting a higher being that you also obey them, I guess.
Yeah, and that from your book and even what you've been talking about here, this relational aspect of pistis, particularly when there's a hierarchy of authority or in divinity, the case power or something of that nature, that relationship, we can say that God is faithful and use that same kind of language, and then we are to be faithful. And going back to what you said earlier about the idea of blind faith or the leap of faith that we talk about now, just throughout the scripture, it's always
evidentiary faith.
It's always based in evidence. Even Jesus himself, when you get this scene of John sending his servants to Jesus, and it's like, are you the one, or should we be looking for someone else? And Jesus doesn't tell him, just believe. Like, just go tell John to believe. No, it's look at what's going on. Look at what's being fulfilled by me. Of course, John's sitting in prison, and the Messiah is supposed to release the prisoners. So maybe this is part of of what's going on. But look at the evidence. I speak often about this idea because I'll hear people talk about this idea of just take a leap of faith, and it's like, well, let's define what we mean by that. Because trust is going to be putting our confidence in God, but this idea of just blindly saying, okay, I know nothing about this God. He hasn't revealed himself at all, but I'm going to be faithful because I want to go to the good place and not the bad place, or something. And we've made this thing kind of like just easy believerism, to where just believe some of this stuff and like you're okay, you're going to be a child of God, like all of this kind of language that is absent in the New Testament. And so would you say that within that relationship, how does God's faithfulness towards us, in the language of Pistis, then meet our faithfulness towards him? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, this. And I'll just take a step back first, actually, and say, this idea of God's faithfulness, of course, whoops, sorry, I just knocked something off a table. This idea of God's faithfulness goes right back into the Jewish scriptures. Mm-hmm. And the story is always that God has always been faithful to Israel, and you can see it through the history of Israel. When Israel puts its trust in God, it does well. When Israel fails God, things go badly. So it's a long story of a relationship, and Christians draw on that. But of course, the earliest Christian witnesses, the apostles and Paul, and the earliest writings, of course, of Paul's, also talk about the impact of Jesus in his earthly life, and talk about the impact of the resurrection experiences. Right. So, for Paul, who knew the apostles after Jesus's earthly life, the impact of the resurrection experiences is absolutely massive. And he has had his own experience, which in 1 Corinthians 15, he characterizes as being very like the resurrection experiences, equivalent to the resurrection experiences. So the witness of these early writers is powerfully built on experience through time, but also personal experience. And then as we go down through the first few generations of Christians, there is also the experience of seeing the earlier generation. So the people that the apostles witnessed to have not known Christ, didn't see the resurrection, the risen Christ themselves, but they have been preached to by people whose lives were completely changed by that experience. So in every generation, people also see the power of the experience of the previous generation and how their lives have been lived out. And that's a kind of a chain of experience that comes down to the present day. I don't know about you, but I think a very powerful aspect of faith for me is to look at all the generations of people that I have known and that I haven't known, who have put their trust in God and have not felt let down. So that chain of experience goes on, really. And so the faithfulness of God is a really important starting point in this. And as you say, human response always is characterized as response. We're never in New Testament writings taking a leap into the total unknown. We're never just kind of picking a side on the basis of future hope, as it were. We're always responding to people's experience, the evidence of the past and the evidence of people's experience, and the power of preaching. Paul says to Thessalonians, you remember when I preached to you, you felt the power of the Spirit. You had the experience that I was preaching to you with power and the Spirit, and you were changed. So Paul also gets people to reflect on their own experience when they receive the gospel and how much difference it makes to them. Coming down a few centuries, Origen has a wonderful thing in his book against Celsus, who was a philosopher who was very against Christians. Origen says the wonderful thing about Christianity is that you can see that it makes people so peaceful and so kind and benevolent and such beautiful characters. And I sometimes think, well, that's an optimistic view, but I think it is actually, it's a bit true of a lot of people.
Sure.
We can all be cynical and think of exceptions to the rule, but actually, you're a pastor, and I also look after a congregation as a priest, and you can look around your congregation and see any number of people whose lives have been changed and are changed every day by their faith, actually. You know,
Yeah, and that experience is just so so incredible to witness in the lives of others. Which as you're talking, I'm drawn more into the story that's playing itself out in Scripture, and God calling people unto Himself, like particularly Abraham, the call of Abraham, and then that passes on. It's the experience of Abraham that passes on to Isaac, that passes on to Jacob, that ultimately God is pointing out to Moses, that I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the scene of the burning bush. And I'm reading again through the Bible through a year with a group that we've established, and it's been great. But one of the things that keeps coming to me is this relational idea of who God has revealed Himself to be, and that He repeats over and over again, or people repeat about Him, that He's the God that brought you out of Egypt, and the God of the Exodus. And so if this is the trust that God is calling them into through the law, everything, all of that language, I'm the Lord your God, the God who brought you out of Egypt. And so it's very experiential, and what tends to happen, or at least in my conceptualization throughout, is then people in subsequent generations are brought into that relationship of trust to this faithful God. And so even Christians, when we get to the New Testament and Christ coming and revealing the Father, revealing this God that revealed Himself in the Old Testament, and so we've got this idea of even us 2,000 years removed from the Christ event, that we're coming into this relationship that's been established for thousands and thousands and thousands of years of people who God has called unto Himself and shown Himself to be faithful. And that just seems to be the thing that's playing itself over and over again. In my opinion, what we get ourselves into trouble with is this radical individualism of, well, this is my faith. And you're not entering into a faith in relationship with other people that the Scripture seems to be so intentional about pointing out. That seems to be really problematic in our situatedness, and even how we think about faith. Again, if we're going to think about it as this blind thing, then we're deciding that all of the evidence and all of the relationship that God has established with people from the very beginning, is just like, well, that has nothing to do with me. This thing's now about me and just this one deity. And
yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mentioned earlier on that faith language, pistis, fides language, evolves these extra meanings through time.
Right.
Perhaps the first new meaning that Christians evolve in pistis language, which is already evident in New Testament writings, is that the sort of trust becomes the bond of trust, becomes the community that is formed by the bond of trust. And that is the earliest meaning of the faith. You know, what we can, and nowadays we use the faith in a very modern sense to mean kind of the whole religion in all its complexity. But its earliest meanings are, the tradition of teaching that is handed down, and the community that is formed by the bond of trust.
Right.
And it is all about entering a community with a past, with a tradition, which is, it's not just a sort of, radical personal election. It is entering into a community which has a long-term understanding of its relationship with God.
Yeah, that's so good, and beneficial for us to ponder and contemplate what it means then to be of the faith, and to use that kind of language that there's absolutely this personal and individual happening, but that's bringing us into a body that is established by the faith, that are recognized as people of the faith, or believers, as we would maybe say more modernly. And so yeah, that's great. So having kind of laid that foundation, can you speak a little bit about how the diversity within the culture that Christianity emerged, and what's going on in, like, you have this Roman, this overarching Roman culture and societal situatedness and societal norms, but then also like this whole history of Judaism that's right there along with it. I mean,
Christianity is a very Jewish. I mean, it starts with the Jews, so like it's very
It's
Jewish.
Jewish messianic cult, yeah, which
Right,
gradually evolves away from mainstream Judaism. Yeah.
Right. So can you speak about how maybe the early Christians saw themselves as different? Because Pistis language would have been used and fides language would have been used of the gods from a Roman perspective and within a Greek culture as well, and some of that of what's going on with just the religiosity of Rome, and then how Christians become radical and using this idea of pistis that may be quite different than how, maybe different and the same of how Roman religion would have used it.
Yeah. So there is a way in which the language that is used in what I think of as mainstream polytheism in the Greek and Roman world. I try not to call it paganism, because pagan was a term of abuse coined by Christians against non-Christians in the early centuries. And in the late 4th century, some non-Christians adopted the term and kind of queered it, as it were, to refer to themselves. But actually it originates as a term of abuse, so I try not to use it. So I think of mainstream polytheists, as it were, and you talked about polytheists just then too. So there are some ways in which pistis language is used similarly, and in some ways in which it is different. So I think the starting point is to say, this is a world in which virtually nobody was an atheist or an agnostic. This is, as far as we can tell, vanishingly rare in this world. Pretty much everybody believed in the gods. They assumed, well, they took for granted, they didn't really, but they took for granted the gods exist. You know, they just took that for granted. They also took for granted that they had a relationship with the gods. The gods were like, they were like big, rich, glamorous, rather dangerous, very noisy neighbors, the gods. Like living next to kind of, you know, two icons of popular culture on either side of your house or something, you know. So they were always there. They were always interfering in human life, and the business of human beings was to kind of keep on the right side of their gods and get them to help and not to harm them. Everybody takes that for granted. But Greeks and Romans are not at all sure that the gods are trustworthy. So, you know, nowadays, I think, you know, a lot of people worry and wonder about whether God exists, but if God does exist, we kind of take for granted he's bound to be trustworthy. It was exactly the opposite in this world. In the ancient world, everyone assumed that gods exist, and people were not at all sure that they were trustworthy, because on the whole, their relationships with them over time were a bit hit and miss, really. So you can get people saying in the ancient world, well, you know, Zeus has always done the right thing by us in our city, you know, so we have a very good relationship with him. But you can also get people recognizing that they put their trust in gods who are totally inconsistent and unhelpful. So people find it difficult to trust the gods. And what is different about both Judaism and Christianity, really, is this complete conviction that God is trustworthy and that you can trust God. And even through the vicissitudes of life, you can trust God. And even when things go badly for you, actually, that is not a sign that God has abandoned you. You know, and that's just a really different mindset. And Christianity inherits that from Judaism, really. But it has this fascinating extra angle that Christians are convinced, early followers of Christ are convinced that God has sent into the world a completely unexpected type of Messiah. So lots of Jews were looking for the Messiah in the 1st century. It was a thing that was, you know, people were looking for the Messiah because they were oppressed by the Romans. They were having a difficult time. So a lot of people were looking for the Messiah. Nobody was looking for the kind of Messiah Jesus was. People were looking for, you know, a royal figure, a son of David, a military leader, you know, a figure of power, an angel even, you know, a figure of power. You know, nobody was looking for a Galilean carpenter. You know. But Christians, people who came to follow Jesus, came to this conviction, first of all, by encountering him in person, then by encountering him risen, then by encountering him exalted, and people who had been changed by him, that actually this extraordinarily unexpected figure really was the Messiah. And that led them to rethink the relationship of trust between God and humanity. So I think early Christians have a much stronger sense that God is kind of taking a risk on humanity by God is putting a new act of trust in humanity, in Christ, by sending to humanity this really unexpected Messiah, and God is trusting people to be able to recognize this Messiah, to get that God is doing something new, you know. And Jesus has to trust people to do that too. And people have to trust that their experience of Christ is trustworthy and that God really is acting in this new way. So with the kind of Christ event, there is this quite new kind of trust going on, that God is, and God is putting God's trust in people to kind of, well, to respond. And maybe the New Testament writers are very clear that people's response is not perfect. You know, even the disciples, Jesus's disciples in all the Gospels, for instance, they get frightened, they run away, they, you know, they fail. They try to do healings and they fail. You know, they're always failing in some way. They have doubts, you know, they don't trust and have to have things proved to them. And so in all sorts of ways, people actually slightly struggle to respond to this Messiah, this unexpected Messiah. And no New Testament writing ever says that is not okay. It's not ideal, but it's not a deal breaker. It's never a deal breaker. Nobody who wants to follow Christ is ever, as it were, kicked out of the group for thinking the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, failing in some way, getting frightened, running away, whatever, you know. So there is this. So in the Christ event, Christians come to think of their relationship of trust with God and Christ as being this very dynamic new kind of relationship. It's not only that God is there and you try to keep a good relationship with God and it either works or it doesn't in the kind of Roman way. It's not even that God has always been faithful to Israel in the sort of Jewish way. It's that God is doing a new thing and is asking for a new relationship. And everybody in that new relationship is having to put a kind of new trust in each other. But that makes the whole situation very, very dynamic. And early Christians also have this real sense that they are entrusted with this gospel. You get this language of entrustedness, that they're entrusted with the mission, with, you know, preaching, with healing, with spreading the word. And so Christians themselves, followers of Christ themselves, become part of God's faithfulness, become part of God's new outreach of trust, become part of the whole sort of enterprise of bringing the rest of the world to trust in God. And that's the thing that is absolutely unique, I think, to Christianity. You know, on the one hand, in the Roman world, slightly dodgy relationship of trust with the gods may work, may not work. You know, in the Jewish world, conviction that God is faithful. Israel sometimes screws up. In the Christian world, God is doing a new thing and you're going to have to help. You know, a new community of trust.
Yeah.
So that kind of new and very dynamic form of trust is the really distinctive thing, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful. When you talk about the difference of how Pistis is working itself out, or fides is working itself out in Roman culture towards the gods, and the gods don't seem to be any better than the humans as far as their like morality or ethics, or they can do what they want, and they do what they want. And so, yeah, from that perspective, it really becomes like, yeah, we're not very trustworthy. So the gods can't be very trustworthy. And so I was talking with Dr. Nijay Gupta about his new book. I don't know if you had an opportunity. It hasn't launched quite yet, but we did a podcast about his book that'll air in a couple of weeks. And he's talking about this idea of strange religion. It's the name of the book, but how strange Christianity was within the Roman culture. One, because there's only one God in Christianity. So they're not talking about trust or belief or acknowledgement of all of these gods. Their trust and their focus is and relationship is with one. And so within that culture, they're the original atheists, the ones that aren't worshiping the pantheon. And that's provocative, but Judaism was already like that. So the Christians aren't so strange in that. But it really becomes strange in the sense that they identify themselves with this concept of pistis, or as we would say, believers. And the Roman culture, like the Roman people, wouldn't have ever considered themselves to be believers in the gods, like in the same sense that Christians, in this relational way, have understood pistis or fides within that culture that was just so radically different than what the Romans would have thought of, or just Rome as a whole, the society would have thought of in relation to the gods. And I think this is what you're getting at. Is would that be correct?
Yes, I mean, something else which is really central to Christianity is that it's a whole life commitment. You know, in a polytheist system, you can always add another cult, you can always add another god that you're, you know, making an offering to, but it's not going to change your life. It's just it's another god. But for Christians, as for Jews, it's a whole life commitment. It defines who you are,
Right.
and your faith. And for Christians above all, your faith, defines who you are. And of course, Christians, one of the ways in which Christians quite early, or many Christians, are evolving away from mainstream Judaism is that from quite an early date, most, if not all, Gentile Christians didn't keep the law. So if you're Jewish, it's not only your faith in God that is your relationship of trust with God that is part of who you are, but it's your law keeping. You know, for Christians, from a fairly early date, most of them are not keeping the law probably, and so their faith becomes the thing, the focus of their relationship with God, the kind of anchor of the whole community, and gradually the whole kind of religion, as it eventually becomes the whole kind of complex system. And we can see that a little bit later than New Testament texts. One of the ways we can see that is that an incredible range of imagery for faith develops. So your own faith, not just the faith, but your own faith becomes a boat that you sail through the choppy seas of life to reach your safe harbor in heaven. And it becomes the ladder that you climb to get to heaven. And it becomes the pearl of great price which you give everything to own. And it becomes the trumpet that you sound in the marketplace, to celebrate who you are and what you stand for. And so Christians are given all these images which kind of speak to the idea that they have a really dynamic, progressive, sometimes battling individual and group life of faith.
Right.
Which takes the place, I think, of kind of keeping the law if you're Jewish, or offering cult to lots of different gods if you're a regular polytheist. Because if you're a polytheist, you do your religion every day of the week by making an offering to a different god every day of the week, say. If you're Jewish, you practice your Judaism by keeping the law every day of the week. If you're Christian, you have this life of faith, this vigorous life of faith, which is all about climbing the ladder and curing yourself of the illness of doubt or sin, and sailing through the world until you get to heaven. And so faith becomes this kind of really dynamic individual and group way of life.
If we're actually thinking through how that's made its way through the history of Christianity from very early on into like how we understand it now, the whole narrative is just it's fascinating and worthy of contemplation to understand then how this should affect us. And just as maybe as our conversation is wrapping up a little bit here, can you talk about maybe twofold here, the hope that you have for the book and have had for the book for several years, I would assume, since you wrote it, that you would hope that people would take from it, and maybe some of the conversations it can start, maybe further research, but also on a more personal level, the sense of how understanding faith should change us in our modern conceptions of the idea.
Yeah. Yes, it's a really interesting question. One thing I really hope out of all the work I've done on early Christian pistis and fides is that people will be reminded how important, how central our relationship of trust in God is, and that anything that we believe is in the service of our relationship of trust. And because belief has become so much more important for Christians, to the point that, for now, hundreds and hundreds of years, Christians have attacked and condemned and sometimes killed each other over tiny differences of belief.
Mm.
And I think I want to say there is a great deal about the mystery of God that we will not understand in this life. Maybe focus a little bit less on whether you and your neighbors believe exactly the right thing about the two natures of Christ, and focus a bit more on whether you can say that you trust in God and you are trying to be faithful to God, and you believe that you're entrusted by God with work in the world. So I think, and I think I see the helpfulness of this in my own congregation, because I will often have members of my congregation who come to me and say, I really struggle with the creed. I know it was created at a certain point in time. I know it responds to a lot of sort of debates that were going on at that time. I know it in some way a very technical, theological thing. I don't know whether I really understand it, and I don't know whether I believe it quite. I mean, do I, I don't really know whether I can say that I believe all these clauses in the creed that I know I don't totally understand. But if I say to somebody, okay, do you trust in God? Can you say that you trust in God? Can you say that you want to be faithful to Christ? They'll say, oh yeah, of course, yes. Well, I think I want people to feel okay about that, to recognize that actually, if you trust in God, if you are trying to be faithful to Christ, if you are trying to fulfill the trust that God and Christ put in you, you're doing the most important thing. And what we believe is also highly relevant, and I'm not against people debating it. But I think the deal breaker for me, as I think the deal breaker for the first generations of Christians, was trust. Do you trust? Are you faithful? Do you accept the trust that's placed in you? So I think I would like to shift the conversation a bit more for ordinary Christians, who are, at the end of the day, all of us, a bit more towards trust and faithfulness and entrustedness, and a little bit away from worrying too much about belief, about the niceties of belief and doctrine. So that's one thing. And going along with that, I think it would be very nice to have a bit more theology of trust. I think theologians could afford to spend more time with this concept and think about, there are theologies of faith, there are theologies of hope, there are theologies of love. I think we could do with more theology of trust. And there is very I followed up Roman faith and Christian faith by writing a book called The New Testament and the Theology of Trust, because I wanted to start that process, really. But I think there is a lot of room for people to think more about, and also to recover the role of trust throughout Christian tradition. It's still actually a popular idea. I think it's always been a popular idea. It's just that it's been a bit ignored by the authorities. And I think recovering the importance of trust to Christians throughout our history is actually worthwhile, and there's work to do there. So I think those are things that I hope will come out of this gradually.
It's interesting to me when you're talking about shifting the focus some, and I think that might make some people uncomfortable. I'm a theologian. I'm a systematic guy by just nature. That's the way that I think. It's the way that I'm wired. And I teach we call it our baptism and membership class. It's 7 weeks here, and really trying to recover some of the ideas of, what are the basics of the faith, that if we're going to trust God, what do we actually need to know? I mean, we speak about this idea of blind faith, and so I want our listeners to understand, and if I'm wrong, just correct me, that you're not saying that stuff's not important.
Oh, no, certainly not. But I am saying that I think when we talk about what we believe, and what we believe is the basis of our trust. It is for us as it was for Paul, of course. Right. We can't trust in God without believing that certain things are true about God and Christ. Sure. But I think for us, as for the first Christians, the things that it is most important to be able to say that we believe are really quite big, broad things. I think I want to be able to say, I believe that God exists, that God loves us all, that God wills to save us all, that God is faithful and also puts trust in us all. And God asks us to respond with trust, with our whole heart, with love, with our whole life.
Mm.
and to accept that we also have work to do for God in the world, to love our neighbor, to love and serve our neighbor.
Mm.
So I can say with very wholeheartedly, that I believe in God, I believe in Christ, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the big broad things. But I think that beyond that, there is much for theologians to debate. And that is interesting and worthwhile and may sometimes be very illuminating. But I would not send another Christian to the stake for having a different view from me on, the precise
loving your neighbor.
Yeah, whether Christ has two wills or only one. I think I think perhaps we can afford to be better at distinguishing the really big stuff from the slightly smaller stuff, and what it really matters to believe from the stuff that it is interesting to debate, but probably isn't life and death.
What we've done within a lot of it is add areas to condemn others in what we're calling the faith, and we're putting pretty strict borders up in certain ways of what can be accepted to be trustworthy and all of those things. And so I can appreciate the shift of focus, and maybe within that, if our focus is shifted more on do we trust God, that some of these other things will through study and through pursuing who God has revealed himself to be, maybe we do become more enlightened to some of the things that aren't the broad, more generalized categories of who God has revealed himself to be. And so maybe starting at that place of trust helps us to have better, more appropriate conversations and disagreements in appropriate ways.
Yeah, perhaps a way to think about it is that our very detailed and very technical thinking about what we believe is always work in progress. Right. It is faith-seeking understanding. I'm not sure that I'm not comfortable claiming that we have achieved understanding in our lifetimes. I think there is much that is yet to be revealed, and so there are really big things that I think that any Christian wants to sign up to and say this is what we believe.
Right.
And then there is much that is still work in progress.
Well, Dr. Morgan, thank you so much for being on and willing to have this conversation. I very much enjoyed it. I think in a lot of ways, it's just been illuminating for me and thinking through your work and what you have done here that I find so beneficial. So I hope our listeners in listening into the conversation will benefit from this. I'm actually sure that they will. So I really appreciate you being on and being willing to do this.
It's absolutely great to talk to you. It's a real pleasure. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Pistis with Us podcast. To keep the conversation going beyond the camera, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page, as well as wherever you listen to your podcasts.